The Arab soldier lacks the characteristics necessary for modern war. Characteristics like rapid reaction, technical competence, a high level of intelligence, adaptability, and above all, the ability to see events realistically and speak the truth, even when it is difficult and bitter. Israeli Chief of General Staff Chaim Bar-Lev put forth this assessment of the Arabs in 1970. 3 years later, in August 1973, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan echoed him in a speech to army officers. Regarding Arab weakness, he said, "It is a weakness that derives from factors that I don't believe will change quickly. The low level of their soldiers in education, technology, and integrity, and inter-Arab divisiveness, which is papered over from time to time, but superficially and for short spans." Little did Dayan know that this hubris would come to haunt him just a few weeks later. I am Dr. Hassan Bukhari, and this is the 20th episode of our series Palestine versus Israel. The Israeli arrogance following the spectacular victory of the Six-Day War knew no bounds. The war of attrition only augmented the Israeli belief that the Arabs were extremely inept and posed no threat. As a result of this feeling of superiority and security, Israel was in no mood for any compromises. So, when Nasser's successor, Anwar Sadat, put forth peace feelers, they were unceremoniously rejected. Sadat also tried to enlist American help to bring Israel to make a deal. Sadat was offering full recognition of Israel and its borders if only Israel would return the territories occupied in the Six-Day War. But the USA proved as intractable as Israel. In September 1971, US Secretary of State William Rogers told the Egyptian Foreign Minister Mahmoud Riyad, if Egypt insisted that Israel should acknowledge an obligation to withdraw completely from all the conquered territories, then he had to state in all frankness that the United States had no means of convincing the Israelis of the need to do this or of imposing such an obligation on them. Israel had also been ceaselessly provoking the Arabs. By 1973, Israel had erected dozens of new settlements on the West Bank, the Golan, and the Sinai, signaling its intent to perpetuate its occupation of these lands. This Israeli behavior left Sadat with no choice but to make war. Disgusted with Israeli intransigence and American apathy, Sadat caustically declared in March 1973, "Everyone has fallen asleep over the Middle East, but they will soon wake up." Thought of having a weak personality and dismissed by many as a lackey of Jamal Abdel Nasser, Sadat surprised his domestic rivals and cemented his grip on the Egyptian presidency by 1971. From then on, he pursued two policies simultaneously to achieve a single end: the restoration of the Sinai to Egypt. The first policy was to try to regain Sinai by making peace with Israel. This policy failed due to Israeli hubris. The second policy was to prepare for war and shock the Israelis into making a deal. In May 1971, he appointed General Saad al-Shazli as the Chief of General Staff. Shazli was an excellent commander, popular with the rank and file of the army. Renowned Egyptian journalist Muhammad Hakel wrote about him, "Beneath his charm and his daring, Shazli was a calculating and meticulous officer. Shazli's planning of the crossing and the studies behind it, which he personally supervised, were to be so brilliantly successful, at least in part, because Shazli concerned himself with the individual movements of virtually every boat in the operation." In 1972, Sadat appointed the well-respected General Ahmed Ismail Ali as the war minister. Another talented general, Abdul Ghani al-Jamseh, was appointed the chief of operations. The trio of Shazli, Ismail, and Jamseh would meticulously plan Sadat's war. For waging a successful war, Sadat needed advanced weaponry designed to conduct offensive operations. He turned to the Soviets, but received a cold and patronizing response. Israeli historian Abraham Rabinovich wrote in his book, The Yom Kippur War, the epic encounter that transformed the Middle East, the Soviets attempted to discourage the Arabs from a military confrontation with Israel that would endanger Moscow's warming relations with Washington. Moscow refused to provide certain offensive weapons systems that the Egyptians demanded, such as the long-range fighter bombers. Transparent Soviet disdain for the fighting ability of the Egyptians further strained relations. On one occasion, Marshal Andrei Grechko, the Soviet defense minister, lectured Sadat on the three prerequisites for a successful war: arms, training, and the will to fight. "The first two you have," said Grechko. Angered by the Soviet behavior, Sadat promptly expelled the Soviet advisors from Egypt in July 1972 and curtly told the Soviet ambassador that the old way of doing business between Egypt and Soviet Union was at an end. This action caused an interesting reaction. Shocked, the Soviets responded by showering their other ally in the Middle East, Syria, with advanced weaponry. According to Jewish historian Howard Sacker, by a curious irony, it was the expulsion of Soviet advisors from Egypt in July 1972 that in the end strengthened Syrian President Hafiz al-Assad's hand. As a rebuke to Sadat and in an effort to consolidate their position elsewhere in the Middle East, the Soviets decided to ship unprecedented quantities of military equipment to Syria, including some 300 new tanks, 300 MiG-21 fighter planes, and hundreds of late-model SAM-6 missiles. A few months after Sadat's rebuke, the Soviets also mended their relations with Egypt and started supplying huge quantities of arms. According to Muhammad Hakel, they seemed anxious to recover lost ground by speeding up the flow of arms, to such an extent that I remember President Sadat saying to me one day, "They are drowning me in new arms." Between December 1972 and June 1973, we received more arms from them than in the whole of the two preceding years. In order to plan the war, a somber ground reality had to be taken into account. The Israelis were vastly superior to the Arabs when the ability of air force and mobile armored forces was concerned. The Arabs had to offset these advantages somehow. Generals Ismail and Shazli advocated a limited objective. They wanted to cross the Suez Canal with huge forces, but instead of launching a sweeping offensive with far-off goals, they recommended that the Egyptian forces establish a bridgehead only 4 to 6 miles deep and then dig in. This would ensure that the crossing forces would be covered by the SAM umbrella and hence would be safe from the Israeli Air Force. This would also neutralize the Israeli edge in mobile armored warfare somewhat, as the Israelis would be forced to attack prepared Egyptian defensive positions with little room for maneuver. In this way, Egypt would reap the advantages of surprise, initiative, and defense simultaneously. Shazli and Ismail also advocated that the crossing be made simultaneously at various points to stretch the Israelis thin and take full advantage of Egyptian numerical superiority. Sadat agreed to the plan as he thought that gaining a foothold on the eastern bank of the Suez Canal would trigger great power intervention, which would in turn be instrumental in getting Israel to vacate Sinai. The Syrian objective in the war was simply to regain the Golan Heights with a surprise assault and then hold them against inevitable Israeli counterattacks. In the months prior to the war, the Egyptian and Syrian chiefs of staff held several joint meetings and injected synergy into their war plans. This was the first time in the history of the Arab-Israel conflict that such a level of coordination between different Arab countries was seen. The Arabs clearly had learned much from their past disasters. Sadat also met King Faisal of Saudi Arabia in August 1973, who promised to declare an oil embargo against the West if the war didn't bring immediate success. King Hussein of Jordan was also contacted. He declined to commit himself to war against the Israelis, but agreed to mobilize his forces in the event of war to tie down some Israeli forces on the Jordanian border. The element of surprise was essential for the Arabs, so they invested a lot in deception tactics. Sadat had even created an interministerial committee for deception in May 1973. He also made some speeches in the summer of 1973 that indicated that he wasn't thinking of war in the short term. Throughout 1973, the Egyptians also conducted frequent exercises in the vicinity of the Suez Canal to confound the Israelis. In the spring of 1973, the Israelis detected significant movement of Egyptian troops, artillery, and bridging equipment to the canal front. The Israeli Defense Forces were placed on a high alert on the recommendation of the Israeli Chief of General Staff, David Al-Azhar. 11 million Israeli pounds were spent on this mobilization. Interestingly, during the height of the crisis on the 18th of April, the Chief of Israeli Military Intelligence, Aman Ali Zera, had told Prime Minister Golda Meir that the chance of war was very low. After the Egyptian movements were proved to be a false alarm, Zera's stock went up, whereas Al-Azhar and his cohorts were accused of panicking and causing significant financial losses for nothing. This episode was still fresh in the minds of the Israelis when in the autumn it was found out by them that Egypt was planning a large military exercise by the name of Tahrir 41 from the 1st to the 7th of October. Unbeknownst to the Israelis, the Egyptians had fixed the date and time of their attack on the 6th of October, 2 p.m. several months ago, and this Tahrir 41 exercise was just a smokescreen. The Syrians were also quite active on the border, but the Israelis ignored this as a reaction to a lopsided dogfight on the 13th of September when 12 Syrian aircraft were downed by the Israelis. According to Howard Sacker, on the 3rd of October, a few hours before the regular cabinet session, the Prime Minister held a kitchen cabinet meeting with Dayan, Yigal Allon, Israel Galilee, and the military commanders. And at that time, the Egyptian and Syrian troop concentrations were discussed. The group agreed unanimously that war was not imminent. In hindsight, this was a bit surprising, especially in light of the fact that King Hussein of Jordan, in a remarkable show of treachery against the Arab cause, had secretly visited Golda Meir on the 25th of September and told her that Syria and Egypt would soon attack Israel. According to Rabinovich, 11 warnings of war were received by Israel during September from well-placed sources. But Zera continued to insist that war was not an Arab option. Not even Hussein's desperate warning succeeded in stirring doubts. On the 5th of October 1973, Ashraf Marwan, Jamal Abdel Nasser's son-in-law and an agent of Mossad, told the Mossad chief Zvi Zamir that Arabs would attack the next day. By now, the warnings had become so numerous that the Israeli leadership finally came around to accept the fact that war was imminent. The next day, on the Jewish high holiday of Yom Kippur, Golda Meir belatedly authorized mobilization of the Israeli Defense Forces. Still, the Israelis underestimated the scale of the war to come. According to Howard Sacker, it was evident that the commanders had not grasped that impending hostilities would mean a full-scale assault on two fronts. The men on the Jolan anticipated at most perhaps a day of battle, the kind they had had in the past. On the canal, the Israelis thought in terms of minor Egyptian commando crossings. Then, at 2 p.m., as the Israeli cabinet was gathered in emergency session, a military aide suddenly entered the conference room and whispered urgently to Miss Meir. The enemy onslaught had begun. Trevor Dupai has narrated an interesting conversation at that time between the commander of the Israeli Southern Front, General and the commander of the Israeli forces in Sinai, General Albert Mendler. A while back, Mendler had then asked permission to bring forward, at least to the central Sinai, his 2 reserve armored brigades that were stationed further east between Rephidim and the Sinai-Israeli frontier. Gonen, after consulting either with General Elazar or General Israel Tai, the Chief of Operations Staff, had not permitted this because it might be considered provocative by the Egyptians. Shortly before 2 p.m., he again called Mendler on the telephone to discuss the situation and said, "Albert, I think you had better start those 2 brigades moving forward." "Yes, I think so," Mendler replied calmly. "We are under air and missile attack." It was 5 minutes past 2. The Israeli fortifications on the east bank of the canal were massive and cost about $300 million to build. Apart from the bunkers, they had built a huge embankment which was more than 20 meters high and 10 meters thick. Not only did it conceal Israeli movements from the Egyptians, but its 45-degree slope from the water's edge ensured that no amphibious vehicle could climb it. The embankment had presented a huge problem to the Egyptian planners, but a young Egyptian engineer had come up with an ingenious solution. He posited that spaces can be created in the embankment through the employment of powerful water cannons. The method was tested and found to be highly effective. According to Trevor Dupuy, before the war, the Israelis had calculated that it would take the Egyptians a day and a half to 2 days to make a few of these gaps by the combined use of demolitions and bulldozers. But with their water jets, the Egyptian engineers had some of the gaps open as soon as 2 hours from beginning their work, or before 6:30 in the evening. Within 15 minutes of the start of the artillery bombardment, the first wave of the 4,000 Egyptian soldiers set off from the western bank of the Suez Canal in rubber and wooden boats. 11 more such waves followed, and by 8 p.m. on the 6th of October, the Egyptians had about 80,000 men on the eastern shore of the canal. Pontoon bridges were also laid for the tanks and other vehicles to cross the canal. According to General Shazli, in 18 hours, the Egyptians had put across the canal 90,000 men, 850 tanks, and 11,000 other vehicles. Prior to the war, Shazli had been ready to accept 10,000 casualties during the crossing alone. Now, the Egyptians managed to land more than 100,000 soldiers and 1,000 tanks on the eastern shore of the canal within 24 hours for the loss of just 280 men. The northern section of the front was held by the Egyptian Second Army, while the shorter southern section of the front was held by the Egyptian Third Army. Both armies had an armored division each, but the Second Army had 3 infantry divisions to the Third's 2. On the Israeli side, General Albert Mendler was commanding the Sinai force, which numbered about 18,000 men. He also had around 300 tanks. The efficient Israeli mobilization system ensured that significant reinforcements would start reaching the Sinai war zone after 24 hours. In 3 to 5 days, the Israelis could build up this force up to 20 brigades and over 100,000 men. But instead of abandoning the beleaguered Bar-Lev line, the Israeli Southern Front commander General Gonen ordered General Mendler to counterattack immediately and throw the Egyptian forces back into the canal. Gonen even envisioned a swift crossing of his forces to the west bank of the canal after this. Mendler's advanced armored brigade launched the attack at around 2:30 p.m., only half an hour after the crossing had started. But by this time, many Egyptian anti-tank infantry units had crossed and were prepared with Sagar anti-tank missiles and RPG-7s. They were also being continuously reinforced. By the evening, almost all of the 100 tanks of Mendler's advanced armored brigade had been wiped out. Not to be deterred, the Israelis committed the other 2 armored brigades of Mendler's force to the attack as soon as they reached the war zone, that is around 8 p.m. This attack also miserably failed. By the morning of 7th October, fewer than 30 of the tanks of Mendler's force remained operable. The much vaunted Israeli Air Force also experienced a decisive defeat on the 6th of October, like the famed Israeli armed forces. According to Howard Secker, the Israeli Air Force Chief General Palad loosed his planes indiscriminately against the amphibious forces, but the crossings were taking place simultaneously along the entire length of the Suez, and Palad's flyers were obliged to disperse to meet this wide-flung operation. Dozens of planes also were shot down by missile salvos. According to Rabinovich, in the first 2 days of war, 35 planes had been lost and there was little to show for it. The Arab missile defenses remained intact. On the 8th of October, General Gonen ordered another effort to smash the Egyptians and then cross the canal. General Adan's newly arrived armored division with 2 armored and 1 mechanized infantry brigade was to make the attack. Abraham Adan warned Gonen that the goals set by him for the attack were too ambitious and the Egyptians were in no mood to turn tail and run away without a fight. But Gonen was unconvinced. He told Adan that he had reliable information from the intelligence that the Egyptians were reaching their breaking point and a vigorous attack was all that was needed to crush them. Adan launched the attack in the morning. The attack failed miserably with heavy losses. It now became clear to the Israelis that the Egyptian army of 1973 was much different from the Egyptian army of 1967. Interestingly, during these first disastrous 48 hours of the war for Israel, the Israeli media had been releasing spurious reports about spectacular but fictional Israeli victories on the Sinai front. One Israeli soldier caustically remarked to a newsman, "We have taught the Egyptians how to fight, and they have taught our radio announcers how to lie." Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan was even more crestfallen. "The third temple is in danger," he remarked wretchedly. In the next episode of Palestine versus Israel, we will discuss the remaining events of the 1973 Arab-Israel War. Stay tuned. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.